Okay, I'm Eric. I'm back with another video, and it is May 19th, and I am in Volgograd, which is in the Russian Federation. I came here a few days ago, and I've reported a little bit, I think, of what's going on here, but I want to give more of a full um, report on what's happened so far. There's a lot going on. So first of all, I came here on May 13th, and I had actually considered having surgery done here. I have a small, not serious medical issue, but it at some point will require surgery. So my friend Andre, who's a doctor, said, just come to Volgograd and we can arrange the surgery. So I spent some time with the surgeon, talking about the pros and cons of having it done here and now. And I finally decided that it would be better to actually wait till I get back to Thailand. So that's what we plan to do. Anyway, I'm staying at the house of my friend Andre, who's a doctor. His wife Olga is also a doctor, and they have a son about 5 years old. Yeah, very, very nice couple, and they very, kindly opened their house to me so that I could stay here. And I think, I learned a lot from them, what it's like to be with a Russian family, and they get to practice. Especially Andre is really trying to continually improve his English, so I get to practice. I get to help him with his English in a very informal, ongoing lesson, so to speak. So, in any case, I have another friend named Sergey, and so there's Sergey, Andre. These are pretty common names, and I have another friend who's helped me a lot here. She lives in Moscow, named Irina, but I had an opportunity to meet another Irina, so I'll explain all that. So, Sergey invited me to go to dinner, and he also practices his English, and he has an English teacher who's from the United States. He's lived here for 10 years. He's married to a Russian wife. He's got a young son, and so Sergey suggested that he invite his friend, his teacher Ryan, and his wife, his Russian wife, to come to this. It's a Georgian restaurant. And we also invited another American English teacher and his wife and their little baby. And we invited two other Russian English teachers, one of whom's name is Nellie and the other one is named is Irina. So we had quite a party at this Georgian restaurant. Now, just to explain, Georgia is a country that is, it's not the state of Georgia in the United States, of course. It's a country that's south of Russia. It used to be part of the Russian Empire and also part of the Soviet Union. And in fact, the famous leader, the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, came from Georgia. He was actually originally, he was a very, very precocious young kid. His father was just a shoemaker. His mother was illiterate, apparently. It was a kind of a tough childhood, but he showed great academic promise. So they sent him, I think it was sent him to like a seminary, and he was, studying, a lot of Christian theology and all kinds of subjects. But eventually he decided that Marxism was the thing for him, and so he got deeply involved in that and revolutionary activities, and he got into some trouble, which is not unusual for people who are revolutionaries. And I think he went to prison actually, and he escaped but came back. So it was pretty, what can I say, pretty exciting time, you could say, for this guy. And eventually, I think by the middle of the 1920s, he essentially became the leader of the Soviet Union. So, but he came from Georgia, and when he was asked what he was, he said, "I'm a how he put it, I'm a Soviet citizen from Georgia. So the point being that even though the Soviet Union was made up of a number of different republics and many different ethnic groups, it's really quite amazing. Georgia has a language that's different from Russian. Their alphabet is completely different from Russian, and yet they were getting along extremely well for quite a long time. Not to say that there weren't some problems, but generally speaking, it worked out. When the Soviet Union ended, Georgia became independent, and at that point, the United States and NATO got their this idea that they were going to turn Georgia into a military base, essentially, to attack Russia from. And by 2008, the U.S. puppet Saakashvili did launch an attack on some of the breakaway areas of Georgia who were really ethnic Russian. They didn't really like being persecuted from the central government, and Saakashvili also attacked some Russian peacekeepers who were there, trying to keep things together. And it didn't work out for Saakashvili because the Russian military, within 5 days, basically, made short work of the Georgian military. There was one other aspect of it, which is that Russia, if Russia had had imperial designs in taking Georgia back, it chose not to do that. It just beat the military, and that was the end of it. But eventually, the Georgian people got tired of Saakashvili. He ended up going to Ukraine and becoming a Ukrainian citizen, because you see, all these people are speaking Russian. The whole space of the former Soviet Union is largely Russian speaking. Last night I was talking with my friend Andre, and he mentioned that his wife Olga her family came from Kazakhstan, and he said that virtually everybody in Kazakhstan, they do speak the Kazakh language, but they speak Russian. So that's kind of an interesting sidelight. So anyway, so we were at this Georgian restaurant. The food was really delicious. I would say that the food in Georgia and Armenia and Bulgaria, these kind of Eastern European countries, and also getting into Greece, they're all the food is kind of related, and it's really delicious. So we did that, and then I got to talk with Nellie, who was sitting next to me, and she speaks very good English. And so we decided the next day to do some sightseeing together, and that's the next part of what I'm talking about. So Sergey and I got together. He picked me up. He's actually a neighbor of Andre's. They didn't know each other, but I had met them each separately through some app where you can meet foreign people and spend time with them. So anyway, Sergey is a neighbor of Andre's, and Andre had to work, but Sergey picked me up, and then so we went. The first place we went to was the Saturday morning and early afternoon flea market, and Sergey went there because you see, every Russian has not everyone, but many Russians have a kind of a summer cottage called a dacha. And in an earlier video, I talked about a dacha that I actually stayed at. So Sergey has this dacha that he's building, and he needed some plumbing supplies, so he went to this flea market. But while I was there, it wasn't just building materials and all various gadgets or whatever it might be, but they also had a lot of Soviet memorabilia. So they had badges with Lenin's profile on it, and Soviet Union symbols, this kind of thing, Heimer and sickle. I thought that was really quite interesting. So we hung out there for a while, but when I decided to buy a couple of these things, and he told me it was gonna cost about $15 for one of them, and about $5 for the second one. So I thought, well, I'm not going to try and bargain with the guy. I don't know, I'm just take his word for it. And so Sergey went off, and he was looking for his plumbing supplies. And he came back, and I gave the guy the money, and he gave me back 150 rubles. Well, he gave me like a 10% discount. And so Sergey said that he had told me that I'm a friend of Russia. I appreciate the what the Russians did to prevent the Nazis from taking over the world, which is what they wanted to do. And so he just gave me a 15% discount. It was pretty nice. So then we went to Mamaya Kurgan, and Mamaya Kurgan is a hill where there's a huge statue of, you could say, Mother Russia. It's like the Russian Statue of Liberty, but in this case, it was built after the Battle of Stalingrad. So Volgograd, the original name for Volgograd was Tsaritsyn, which means yellow sand, I guess, because of it's along the Volga River, which is a huge river. It even has islands in it that are so big that you can build settlements on them. But in any case, the name Tsaritsyn was changed to Stalingrad, I guess, during the 1930s, because this it was, I think, probably a fairly small city, became quite a major manufacturing center and a major logistical center for the Soviet Union. And so by the beginning of World War II, it had a population of somewhere, I think, around 400,000 people. And of course, what happened was after the Soviet Union managed to beat back the initial assault in 1941, Hitler and his gang decided that the next best thing to do would be to try and do an end run around Moscow and attack Stalingrad, because Stalingrad was a major logistical center, and also because the very name Stalin, if the Germans and their allies had captured Stalingrad, it would have been a major, reputational defeat, you could say, for the Soviet Union. And of course, the Soviet Union, absolutely was not going to allow that to happen. So as a result, there was a battle there where roughly 1 million people on both sides, that is 1 million Soviet soldiers and 1 million German soldiers and their allies. So it was not just, people think that it was just Germany, but it was actually Germany, Romania, Hungary, Italy, and I think those are the main countries that were attacking Stalingrad. But the Soviet Union was attacked by more than just Nazi Germany. It had other allies, which strangely enough are also in NATO now. Isn't that kind of a strange coincidence? But anyway, so the Soviets defeated the Nazis at Stalingrad, but one of the major battlegrounds was this hill, and so they built this huge statue of Mother, you could say, of Mother Russia, with a huge sword in her hand like this, and she's beckoning to people to go into battle and fight the invaders. It's very, very dramatic, and I'll post some photos along with this video. So and when I went there, this was I guess Saturday, a couple of days ago. There were just hundreds of people there, and nowadays I think most people in Russia understand the nature of this conflict in Ukraine. Just for those of you who haven't figured it out yet, during World War II, there were the vast majority of people who live in the area called Ukraine, which was part of the Russian Empire for centuries. most of them were loyal to the Soviet Union. But there was one grouping in primarily in western Ukraine, that sided with the Nazis, and they committed some serious atrocities, massacres, one being at Baba Yar, and there's a famous poem about it. Just a terrible situation where I think 30,000 people are just massacred. But eventually, of course, the Soviet Union defeated the Germans and their Ukrainian allies, and the Finns and the Romanians and Hungarians, these other countries that had invaded the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union essentially defeated all of them, basically crushing roughly 75 to 80% of the invading force. Something like 200 divisions attacked the Soviet Union, whereas when the Allies, primarily the United States and England, went to attack Nazi Germany from the west. It was called the Normandy landing. They were only facing about 11 divisions, and those 11 divisions were made up of the residue of German troops that had suffered very, very serious losses. So so basically the Soviet Union almost, you could say, 80% single-handedly defeated the Germans and their allies. And I bring this up because recently President Trump bragged about the fact that the United States did most of the fighting and most of the winning in World War II, which is one of the, to be charitable, misinformed. But I could probably use, other adjectives or nouns to describe President Trump's understanding of what actually went on during World War II. Back to Stalingrad, and so we went to this amazing statue, and there's a big hallway there with probably thousands of names of the people who were killed there on basically on these wall. They're not murals; they're kind of like bas reliefs where the names are etched in metal on these large panels. And every 30 minutes there's an honor guard that marches and does a kind of a little ceremony. They're kind of protecting this hallway, this sacred hallway, and there in the middle of the hallway is an arm raised with a torch in it. So that was that's very impressive. And so then the plan was to meet Nellie and Irina, the two Russian English teachers, afterwards. And so Sergei and I didn't know about this, but Sergei said, "Hey, let's go to this. There's a Stalin museum." So we went to this building. It's a small museum, and it has a lot of kind of newspaper clippings and things of that nature, documents talking about what happened during Stalin's rule. Had everything from when Stalin became the leader of the Soviet Union to the newspaper article where it says that he had died, and it also had quotes from people like quotes from Stalin himself, and one of them, I forget, the gist of it was that he said that after he died, his reputation would be ruined, and people would feel, would hate him and disparage him. He said, but over time, the truth of what he did would come out finally, and he would be honored. So that's actually what you're seeing in Russia now, is that for a long time he was disparaged. So background on this, my friend Sergei told me a very, very interesting story. So Stalin died in 1953, and Khrushchev became the new premier of the Soviet Union. Now, Khrushchev actually came from the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and it would appear that he had, somewhat, what can I say, maybe mixed loyalties somehow, because he did several things that were, really um, uh, damaging to the Soviet Union and caused some serious problems. One of the things that he did was that after the Soviets defeated the Ukrainian Nazis in World War II, many of these people were in prison, and they were going to stay in prison for a long time. But Khrushchev decided to give them amnesty a couple of years after Stalin died, and so they were released, and they were so-called rehabilitated, and they took positions in the Ukraine government. But in fact, their loyalties were hardly to the Soviet Union. Another thing that he did was Crimea, the peninsula that was it was fought over by in the 19th century by England and France and Turkey and Italy, I believe. They all attacked Crimea. They wanted to take it for themselves. The reason for that is because Crimea it's a peninsula that juts out into the Black Sea, and if you have control of that peninsula, that gives you a major degree of control over the Black Sea. But it's also a very beautiful area, and they have great agriculture there, and it's very historic. There's a lot of archaeological diggings and things of that nature. So, I've visited there. I'm actually going to be going there later today, and you go there and you just think, I understand why they're fighting over it, because it's just a beautiful place. But Khrushchev made an administrative decision unilaterally to decide that Crimea was no longer part of the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic, but is now part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And now Ukraine has a mixed population. Most of it is Russian speaking, but there's a lot of people who speak Ukrainian, which is a kind of an amalgam of Polish and other languages, including Russian. The alphabet is very, very similar to the Russian alphabet, although there's some slight differences. Ukraine, there was a large, almost everybody spoke Russian. A fair number of people spoke Ukrainian and speak Ukrainian now. There were parts of Hungary that were part of Ukraine where much of the population speaks Hungarian. There's Romanian, there's Slovakian areas, Slovakian-speaking areas. So Ukraine is a kind of a mixed ethnicity. And it all basically worked during the Soviet Union, although this problem was kind of it was developing underneath the surface. And when the Soviet Union ended, these more nationalistic elements became more and more powerful. And eventually, especially with the help of the West, which had pumped Ukraine full of anti-Soviet propaganda, more and more the people forgot about who had liberated them. So that's one of the main roots of this conflict. Now, just to give you kind of a counterpoint to this, the Ukrainians are told that the Russians were bad and the Soviet Union was bad and these kinds of things. And my friend Sergei, he has family in Kiev and Sumy, another area of Ukraine, and they're actually on the phone with each other. They're talking with each other. They're family. So to say that, and they get along. They have good feelings for each other, but because of this international conflict that was fomented by the West, because these nationalists, these far-right nationalist, violent people they were nurtured by and funded by and supplied by the United States. So this whole conflict was really created artificially. There was no reason for it to happen. Um, and yet, Trump says, well, we're acting as a mediator. The United States is not a mediator in this. They're supplying all the weapons to Ukraine. How can you be a mediator when you're really a party to the conflict? That goes also for the French, who were acting as mediators in one of the earlier iterations of peace talks, and they knew very well that they had no intention of fulfilling the obligations of the peace talks. The British have been undermining peace in Ukraine for decades. The Germans likewise were involved in peace talks to try and resolve the situation. That it really came to a head in 2014 when there was a coup that was fomented essentially under the Obama administration with Joe Biden and his Lieutenant Victoria Nuland. A lot of you who are listening to this probably know all about that, but just for those of you who don't know. But as I was saying, I have this friend who lives in the city of Dnipropetrovsk, and it's a city of about 1 million people, and it's on the Volga River, it's on the Dnieper River, excuse me, it's on the Dnieper River, and which is also a very large river, and I met her in Chiang Mai, and she told me, and other people, many people have told me they were very happy in the Soviet Union, and other people who said that they were opposed to it realized that life was actually better in the Soviet Union than it is now. So anytime you hear stories about how terrible it was in the Soviet Union, is it really a lot of this stuff is just plain fabrication, frankly. And for example, Solzhenitsyn was a writer who wrote a number of novels, which presumably told the real story of the Soviet Union, but in fact these stories were fabricated. He was just a guy who just didn't like it there, and he made up these stories to give the Soviet Union a bad name. And of course, if you did that, now you're automatically a friend of the West. So that's kind of a little more background. So here we are at this Stalin Museum, and then after the Stalin Museum, I just want to mention that there's a quote by Churchill, and basically Churchill absolutely hated Stalin because Churchill is all about the British Empire. The British Empire. The British are racially superior. They're supposed to rule the world. This is the white man's burden, and it's okay if you allow millions of Indians to starve to death through a famine that you induced, because they're just multiplying like rabbits, as Churchill said, and so their lives don't really count. But the problem is that people like Stalin and the Soviet Union were standing up to the British Empire, and so Churchill didn't like that. And of course, Churchill, the city of London, this is like the Mecca, so to speak. This is like the heart of capitalism, is the British bankers. And of course, they didn't like that the Soviet Union was not under their control. So that was another issue with them. And but the problem was that Stalin was an extremely powerful leader, extremely well educated, and Churchill himself said that the Soviets kicked the guts out of the Nazi army during World War II. So even though, as I say, Churchill, even though he hated the Soviet Union, he needed the Soviet Union because if the Soviet Union had not fought the Nazis, they would have taken over England and Churchill would have lost his job. Because you see this whole, there's been a conflict between Germany and England in terms of their respective empires. And so Churchill was quite happy for the Nazis to invade Russia because that took the heat off of England, and so they supported Russia and supported the Soviet Union during World War II. But what was really weird was that as soon as the Soviet Union defeated the Nazis, um, Churchill said, "Okay, well now that the Nazis are now that our principal rival, the Germans, are out of the way. Let's go back to fighting the Russians." And he created a plan called Operation Unthinkable, using Wehrmacht, that is the former German army soldiers, to reattack the Soviet Union, along with British and other, whatever coalition of the willing at that time Churchill wanted to invade the Soviet Union. But of course, the Soviet intelligence was quite good. They could see some military maneuvering, and so Churchill says, or rather, Stalin says to Churchill, "Excuse me, it looks to me like you're trying to invade us, and what the hell is going on?" And Churchill says, "Well, I don't know anything about this. I'll have to check with what's going on, and we'll make sure it's all properly taken care of." But he was a complete snake, Churchill. Um, so Churchill there's a big quote on one of the walls where he said he really had to admire Stalin, even though he considered him ultimately an enemy. So that was the museum, and we also talked with the curator. Now, of course, I speak, it's just a smattering of Russian, but Sergei is, of course, he's a Russian person. So he was talking with the woman who was kind of the attendant at the museum, and I asked her because there's been a sentiment for changing the name of Volgograd back to Stalingrad, and so she talked at length about that. And recently, in fact, Vladimir Putin, who's the president of the Russian Federation, was approached by, I guess he was like the representative of a veterans group, and this guy said, "Would you please change the name of the Volgograd airport to the Stalingrad International Airport?" And lo and behold, when I showed up in Volgograd, a couple of days later, that sign had changed. It's Stalingrad Airport. So I asked her, what are the chances of it turning into Stalingrad again? And she said it's unlikely at this point, even though there is sentiment for it, because just the logistics of changing the name, it would be very expensive, and Russia's got bigger problems than just changing the names of a particular city. So that was her reason why they probably won't do it, at least anytime soon. So that was interesting. And then this other thing that I wanted to talk about was Sergei. I asked Sergei what was the reason why there was such bad blood between Khrushchev and Stalin. So, as I mentioned, after Stalin died, Khrushchev gave what is called a secret speech, in which he accused Stalin of numerous crimes, which is rather debatable, and many people did not agree with Khrushchev's assessment. The Chinese at that time were furious about this, and that was so Khrushchev actually, you could say, incited the Sino-Soviet split. That is the conflict between communist China and the Soviet Union, and because the Soviet Union and China were kind of against each other, that gave the U.S. an opening to basically weaken or attempt to weaken both countries. And eventually they did weaken the Soviet Union internally through propaganda and economic pressure that eventually it did fold. Um, but what was the reason why Khrushchev was so angry with Stalin? Sergei told me that, according to his grandfather, Stalin's son was a lieutenant in the Soviet army, and he was captured by the Germans, and he was a prisoner of war. The Germans were very concerned about losing the Battle of Stalingrad, and so they sent a message to the Soviets, sent a message to Stalin himself, saying that he would free, that is, the Germans would free Stalin's son if the Soviets would free the captive German general von Paulus. Von Paulus had been the commander of the forces that had attempted to take Stalingrad. They had failed. They were captured, and so von Paulus was a prisoner of war by the Soviets. Stalin's son is a prisoner of war of the Germans, and Germany wanted to make a trade. And Stalin, talking about steel nerves, he said, "I'm sorry that we don't trade a lieutenant for a general." And Stalin's son, this, as the story goes, attempted to escape from prison camp. He tried to climb over a fence, but it was electrified, and he was electrocuted, trying to escape. On the other hand, Nikita Khrushchev's son was also a prisoner of war, and as Sergei tells the story, he actually switched sides, and he was not loyal to the Soviet Union. But when the war ended, Churchill's son, not Churchill, but Khrushchev's son was, taken back by the Soviet Union, and traitors to the Soviet Union were not treated lightly. He was considered a traitor, and he was planning to be executed. So Khrushchev said to Stalin, because Khrushchev himself was a military person, Nikita Khrushchev later became the premier of the Soviet Union. He said to Stalin, please, show some clemency towards my son. And Stalin said to Khrushchev, "Look, my son was a lieutenant. I had a chance to free him. He's a lieutenant. That's not the rules of war, and I'm sorry, but I can't. You can't have favoritism just because you were a high-placed person in the Soviet Union. Your son does not get special treatment." And it was because of that, according to Sergei, my friend, that Nikita Khrushchev, rapidly turned against Stalin, and initiated this de-Stalinization campaign, where Stalin's name was basically run through the dirt and seriously discredited. What's interesting to me is the fact that many of the stories about Stalin were later debunked by researchers like Grover Four. Grover Four is a historian. He went into the Soviet archives, and he discovered a lot of what we were told about the Soviet Union simply wasn't true, because the actual records of the Soviet Union said that things, for example, like there was a serious famine in Ukraine in the early 1930s, and many people died, and the Ukrainian nationalists said, "Oh, you nasty Soviets, you committed genocide against our people." Well, that's just not true. The reality was that there was a serious famine throughout the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had been under tremendous economic pressure by the West. They really wanted it to fail. The fact of the matter is that after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, Western countries and Japan were, really, really upset about that. And so in 1918, the United States and England and Czechoslovakia and Japan and other countries invaded the Soviet Union to reverse the Russian Revolution. So just think about what would have happened in the American Revolution when we, kicked out the royalty, that was ruling the colonies. The American people said, we don't need kings to be ruling us. We want to rule ourselves, and we're going to fight to get rid of these people. And so the Americans, people won the revolution. However, there were loyalists to the British, and they were not happy about that. And can you imagine what it would have been like if the loyalists to the British Empire in the American colonies had got their way and encouraged other countries to invade the new United States? They asked Russia to invade the United States, and the Russian Empire, rather than invade the United States, actually gave them diplomatic and commercial support. So Russia was the ally of the United States during the American Revolution, and the Americans were the enemy of the Russian people in the Russian Revolution. So let's just keep that as part of the mix of why there's a problem between the United States and Russia. So I think, let's see, I've been talking for about 40 minutes here. I'm rambling, but I hope I'm giving you some background on what's, what some of my experience here is in Volgograd. And I'll be talking more about these kinds of, I'm trying to bring historical awareness to create some context for the current conflict in Ukraine so that people can understand better what's actually going on there, and have I would say, an opinion that's based on actual historical fact, not on what the mainstream media has been telling you for the last, 3 years. Most of the people who have strong opinions about Ukraine have not been following it since 2014, when there was a coup that was created by the United States. When that happened, overthrowing a democratically elected government. They don't know about the bombing of the people who opposed the coup. They don't know about a massacre that occurred on May 2nd in 2014 in Odessa. They don't know any of this stuff. So all they know is that Russia invaded Ukraine unprovoked. Please get that idea out of your head. It's completely false. It has absolutely no truth to it. So I'll just wrap it up there, and I'll post this, and I'll put some other information about these first few days in Volgograd. So thank you, and I'll talk with you soon.